Ah yes, the everlasting question of watch sizes and do they matter? Do they really matter? Is it relevant? Well, it's the one topic that is hotly debated. It's the most contested subject of all, I would say, and probably will always be. It's timeless at this point. It doesn't take a lot to stoke the fire. Post a question about a watch that you own, the size of it, and enjoy seeing two different sides clash on whether or not it works. There is great conflict around this, which I find perplexing, kind of peculiar. And the point of this video is to look not only at various watch sizes, but also address where I think the sizes are relevant, where they actually work. Naturally, we all have our own biases. We all have different wrist sizes, so watches need to work for the wrist that you have. It's difficult to separate your mind away from the preferences that you have and look holistically at the wider audience that these watches are possibly catering to. Naturally, like you, I am an enthusiast. I love my watches, regardless of the size. Anything from 36 to 43 millimeters is my sweet spot, and I own watches from 36 to 41. I enjoy them and their sizes for different reasons, and that is another point I hope to address later on. Let's begin with a very brief summary of the evolution of watch sizes. We look back 100 years to 1920, can you believe it? For the first time, the wristwatch had pretty much become mainstream at that point. It all began as a fashion accessory for ladies. Men of that era didn't see them to be practical whatsoever. The time to use wristwatches came from necessity. These men were thrown into the trenches and needed a practical, simple solution to tell the time without any hindrance. And the wristwatch evolved from there. During the 1920s, the sizes of these objects were pretty small. And that went all the way up until the 40s. 33 millimeters was the style. And only when we move more to the instruments of the era, like for aviation, do we see the sizes increase. As daily wearing watches, through the 40s and onwards, 33 to 35 millimeters was the norm. Today, what we consider ludicrous, 30 and 33 millimeter chronographs, this was how they were addressed. Could we say then at the time that brands hadn't fully tapped into the true potential of watch size and its relevance on the wrist, how in fact a larger size would make it more applicable? Or if we do refer back 100 years, can we say that people were naturally a lot smaller in size due to, let's be honest, malnourishment because of the depression? We talk about how their dietary requirements were different back then. Let's just say then throughout that time we saw watches average in that smaller size bracket, and only when we started looking to the dive watches, the avigation pieces, the models that had more intent around them instead of just being time-telling devices, but ones that needed to be legible, so their sizes increased. Most of us can agree that when the brands started using 40 millimeters sizes, they had struck gold. There is one brand in particular that we can pretty much roll off our tongues. That size then, and now, still remains relevant. We talk about the Goldilocks effect, we talk about the golden ratio. There is some sound evidence telling us that the 40 millimeter size, technically 39.87 millimeters, falls into the golden ratio excellently, and it's that balance, that presence on the wrist, regardless of your size, feels right. After moving into the 90s, we started seeing sizes expand more and more with the introduction of the Navitimers and Panarais of the era. And now today, in this era, we are privileged enough to say that we have a choice of any watch size that suits our needs, our requirements, our wrist sizes. Ironically, we scrutinize them now more than we ever did before. Let's for a moment separate and put a line between sports watches and dress watches. They have two very different applications. Unfortunately, the lines between them are very blurred. Where does the sports watch end and the dress watch begin? Especially when we look to the 70s inspirations, those integrated bracelet models, we look to how any watch today on a leather strap can be considered a dress watch. The truest dress watch, the epitome of the dress watch, is one that has as little complication as possible on its dial for its presentation. It reduces itself down to the bare minimum of its purpose. So of course we can compare them to be smaller in size next to their sports watch contemporaries. The modern dress watch has found an excellent spot where it sits in this 39 millimeter category, where regardless of your wrist size, it occupies the space very well. The proportions have been well considered, performs its base function of time telling, maybe has a few complications like perpetual calendars or a small chronograph feature, whereas the sports watch today has moved into a completely different direction. There are so many subgenres within this category, some that look insanely overbuilt, some that just look unnecessary. A great handful that we could define as the modern watch since technically dress watches have fallen out of favor in recent years, especially amongst the masses. And then at the end of the spectrum, we find the sports watches that many put in quotations as undersized, especially for the modern circumstances we live in today. And it's this zone in particular, the undersized 36 and less millimeter sized sports watch, that gets the most hate, debate, interest, conflict revolving around it. Let's keep it basic, talk the brass tacks. I think it's good before even considering the size of the watch to see how well it addresses what its core intention is. We are getting really deep here, but bear with me. You know that old saying when they say less is more? Well, when you're dealing with something that is made to merely tell you the time, has no other external complication or need to do anything else, surprisingly, when you reduce the watch size down, it feels a lot more considered. It feels like a lot more thought went into the parts, into the individual components. There is nothing more awkward than seeing a 42mm sized dress watch, shall we say, that has barely anything on the dial. It looks completely vacant. At the same time, this can be said for a dive watch that is undersized, that deserves a lot more breathing room because, well, naturally it's needed to be more legible. There is this fine balance, and I believe what truly defines this whole video is you need to factor in proportions when you're looking at a watch. Not only its application, whether it's a dive watch, pilot watch, dress watch, any of the other areas, but also just how well everything is placed on the dial. And if the size is truly relevant to the application of the instrument. Within these little tiers, you find amazing executions of watches, regardless of their sizes. And this is where I think a lot of people are missing the point. In a past video, I addressed the subject of why there's so much text on the dial of a watch, especially sports watches. And I believe it in part is due to the size increase of a lot of these pieces, where there is so much open space, vacant space, unnecessarily there, that the text is made to essentially cover up those open areas. I find it amazing that today, with all the modern technologies and the pieces that we can now choose, there is still so much debate about watch sizes. If you want a quick designer's opinion on watch size, given the choice to create the piece, I would always want to reduce the size of the watch down as much as possible within the parameters of its application. So dealing with a dive watch, what would the ideal size be for me? I would say around 43mm at maximum. Dealing with an aviation watch, 44mm. But then looking at this in-between area of the sports watch, the one that tells you the time, within the 36 and the 40mm category is fantastic. And what makes the greatest difference is that everything on the dial needs to be scaled appropriately to feel as relevant next to the case and all of those elements. It's a difficult thing to address, but a simple throwaway comment saying that the size is too small, 35mm is irrelevant. Well, 50 years ago, that was the norm. That was the size that our parents and grandparents were wearing. Does it mean then that the modern man or woman needs to wear a bigger watch in order to compete with one another? Is a bigger watch necessary for the sake of presence, or can it at times ruin the inherent subtlety that the original designs maybe wanted to carry on? What are your thoughts on this? Again, I have to emphasize that all of this is relative and not everyone will agree. But the way the size of the watch changes over time, how there was a big trend to follow the big watches, and now today we are reducing down to sizes that are fairly wearable and unisex. I believe that some brands are really making strides in this area and are finding a sweet spot, could we say a return to the new Goldilocks proportions. It's an interesting time for modern watchmaking, and regardless of your preference, it is definitely worth appreciating the variety that is now on offer.